Steve's got his hand up.
Yes.
We're going to go to a raise your hand and
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thanks. So my question, I've got two questions really. First one is a very quick one. You mentioned there was a kind of national trauma when they tried settlement clearance.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to understand more about the sort of shape of that trauma, what kind of shape that had. And the second was, I'm kind of aware there's quite a lot of young liberals in Israel, and I know some of them kind of have some kind of allyship with the cause of the Palestinians. So it'd be interesting to understand what kind of shape that takes, and whether it's purely just a kind of empathy, or whether there's any kind of political, or potential for a solution arising out of that aspect, or any kind of models arising out of that. Thank you.
That's great. So when Israel removed the settlements in Gaza, they were mostly close to the border, as far as I understand it. They were in the low thousands, the number of people that were removed. And I don't know, I saw a movie about it, and I mean, the movie's portrayal was literally a fight with Israeli Defense Force soldiers. They were incredibly mad that they had to leave. I mean, they were compensated fully, but they had to leave their property behind. Now, in terms of a national trauma, maybe the language I used was a little too loose around that. So I'm not sure if it was so much a national trauma, but there was a sense that this is extremely difficult to do. I mean, we're talking about the bare minimum of getting out of the West Bank that you'd have to get out would be like 50,000 to 100,000 settlers. The most religiously extreme from the deep settlements. These are also probably the most violent, who are used to being well armed everywhere they go. A lot of people say this could just be a civil war now. So after they saw that in 2005 or 2006, I get it mixed up, they've been much more reluctant to do anything with settlers. They also might have been removed from their, there's various theories about it, I'll just say. So it's not clear what their intent was in removing them. Now, in terms of the youth in Israel, sadly, I don't think we can look to the youth. I mean, we usually think of Gen Z, millennials, they're going to be much more liberal. This is the general thing throughout the world. Possibly that's the case in Israel as well. I'm not sure about the demographics there. But the problem with Israel, the way this politician friend of mine had put it, he was a founder of Peace Now, which was the main peace group pushing for a two-state solution, a co-founder, one of many co-founders, don't want to exaggerate his role. He said in the 80s, we could get 400,000 people out to a peace protest of some kind, whatever it was. Now we'd be lucky to get 4,000 out. When I've looked since that time in the past 7 years, I don't think I've seen any demonstrations that had anything to do with a two-state solution or Palestinian rights that ever made it beyond like 5,000 people or so. 4,000 people could overturn 400,000 people could overturn a government. A couple 100,000 people could get major political change. I think you'd have to get numbers much higher. Generally, it's drifting so far to the right or drifting so far towards ethno-nationalism, if you don't want to use a left-right scale, that it's difficult to see change happening on the Israeli side. I'll say again, another person, I had lunch with a former campaign manager to, I won't say the name because I've identified this guy and been critical of him. I tend not to name my sources, but let's just say one of their furthest left prime ministers in their history. He was a campaign manager for him and an advisor to him. And he sounded, I mean, this to me was like, this was a wealthy guy who behaved like, he did not behave like the left. He just not like anything a European or an American would recognize as the left. And he painted himself as so far left, so there's no hope of us getting in power for the foreseeable future. There's just no hope, that it's changed so much. That makes peacemaking difficult. But anyways, I probably said too much. I'll try to be quicker on other questions so we have more of a dialogue here.
No,
Go ahead, Barbara.
I want to talk a little bit about demographics and real spiral stages. So one of the things that you hit upon, but I think you missed it as the driving factor, is the fact that purple, red, blue communities have 10 times the birth rates that any developed society has. So what you're doing out there in the Lebanese camps, in the Israeli settlers, is you're basically not, you're not having a regression from Israel. You're not having any regression from Israel. The settlers, and maybe there's a few people still left in Israel who want to go into that mode, but the settlers are simply outpopulating the rest of the country. And the U.S. has that same problem right now with our right-wing religious fanatics, right? Their birth rates are 10 times those of normal middle-class professional women. And I don't know if you're not going to push birth control in a major way with any of these solutions, forget it. It is the driving factor, and to think of it as regression is just wrong.
So I think you're right about that factors driving things. I think it's ignored all over the world as well.
Yes.
And we see this all over the world. I do see the regression happening because I see it within. Okay, so you can say, I guess you can say, well, if the demographics are changing, the political parties will change. I've seen
Right.
it in individuals, and I've seen individuals talk about it in individuals. So now that's tricky too, because you have a thing in Jewish communities where there's a saying that some of you might have heard that I've only been able to attribute to Jews. If you're not a socialist when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no brain.
My dad
I've
used to
heard
say
that
that, he
other
wasn't
places
Jewish.
too.
What's that? Oh, he did.
Yeah.
I'd only come across it in Jewish communities. I'd heard it early. So I've noticed a trend more so in Jewish communities of being more liberal or more socialist early on and getting more conservative as you get older. So that complicates the demographics as well, if that's going on even. But this is,
Well,
I have no
there's
systematic
also
research.
the orange thing of strategic political, right? So don't ever, if someone has already reached orange, do not assume they've regressed by moving to the right. They're simply
Yeah.
playing their political cards, and
Yeah.
that's really unfortunate. But it's where the U.S. Business community is, right?
Yeah.
It's not that they agree with these nutcases. It's simply to keep power. They're willing to cater to them.
Yeah.
So again, it's not regression at my level. It's a deliberate conservatism to play into the what they view as how to keep political power, and it's pretty pathetic when you look at it here.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair enough. That is happening. I think the easiest way to kind of get a sense of if someone in this situation is someone regressing is what's their circle of inclusion? Who do they see as being worthy of moral consideration? Who do they consider in their national identity? Their social identity, the groups of their social identities. That's a good place to look as well. And in that sense,
And you're seeing a regression not to blue, but to purple tribalism, right?
No. I want to be clear. Anything I've said about tribalism, tribes, which is going to be different than tribalism in spiral dynamics. Tribes are forms of organization that exist in all sorts of societies, and they all
Right.
function kind of differently. And you can keep tribal groups functioning as a society develops and people within it, they're going off and getting their master's degrees. I mean, my friend was talking about, so my friend outside of Bethlehem, this is my good friend in the West Bank. he says, randomly in conversation, he's saying, and my tribe's really powerful. I was like, so what's that mean to you? And he says, well, we've got 15,000 members. What that means is they're going to support me if anything happens to me, and it's good to have a bigger tribe because of that. And I was like, so why do you identify with, what do you do with them? It's just like, well, that's just your support group. And so if you're African, this tribes tend to be scattered throughout. In Palestine, it will tend to be tribes in one city, and your tribes in one village maybe, and this is just your support network. In Africa, they're all scattered, so when you go to Lagos in Nigeria from the north, you look for your tribal members and they're going to help you get set up. Why? I don't know. It might be like when I was a hippie, and it was just like, I'll look for the hippies because, well, I got to hang out with somebody, and they might meditate and be vegetarian as well. So
Well, but that's a, you know, that's a little different than the tribalism that's taking over the U.S. politics scene, right?
absolutely, totally different
Yeah.
thing. Totally different
It's
thing.
a functional
It's functional.
tribalism
Yeah.
that could develop into a stable society.
Yes, and it could
If
degenerate.
if Israel didn't keep stirring the pot.
Yeah.
Paul, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Theo, you had mentioned the Palestinian diaspora, the strategies that the Palestinian people who have left Palestine. Do you see a lot of communication between, and I'll say it's the Palestinian diaspora members and the Jewish diaspora members?
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any impediment whatsoever to it, but not a lot of communication. I think that's probably mostly because these are small minorities.
Okay.
I mean, Palestinian shows up even less than the Jewish minority, although they're generally the same. I usually think in my head, I've got stuck 15 million Palestinians, 15 million Jews in the world. The numbers have probably changed, and they were probably a little different than that. But that's a good starting point, as sort of rule of thumb. So that means, and they're scattered all over the place. Jews show up more. They tend to be more integrated into the societies that they've come to and have been highly successful. In my experience, it's kind of usually when Jews and Palestinians meet, when they're a little more liberal, it's like, yay, we're friends. Like, this is cool. There's like, you know, if I meet a Palestinian, I'll say, I'm Jewish, and they're like, yay, let's be friends. Like, I've come to expect that response. There's a little distance. Now, what that turns into later, or if I said I'm Jewish, how do you feel about that? Might be different. I don't know. They probably sense something in my curiosity about their identity that. So, I have a very small sampling here to answer that question. Unfortunately, very small.
I guess what stimulated the question in my mind is, you know, it seems like if there are, and you articulated a lot of solutions here, or some solutions very eloquently, that if solutions are going to be arrived at, they could come out of that
Yes.
combined diaspora of Jewish and Palestinian individuals. Because what you also kind of described of what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Israel is, for the lack of a better word, I'll just say this: the people who are doing the negotiating, the people who are in power are they're just not coming up with solutions that will, you know, have a hope of being successful.
Yeah, I do think I think there's a lot of possibilities. I'm biased towards these solutions. So, you know, Lebanon is in a situation right now where they have a highly successful, highly educated diaspora, incredibly wealthy, and yet the country, which it's a mess. You talk about the developmental spectrum. It's all over the map, but they're experiencing hyperinflation, so the economy has just tanked. It's like, I just think, oh, look to the diaspora, maybe they can help out. The Irish diaspora was heavily involved in Ireland, mainly from the United States. I'm not sure if Italians in the United States have done much for Italy ever. Maybe it's because it's a bigger country, but when you've got a very small country, I think a lot becomes possible from what the outsiders can offer. I just don't know how to, I don't know how to operationalize that though.
Well, I don't know that there's any proactive way of doing it. It seems like so many problems, you know, and again, this goes back to the spiral dynamics model. Change comes out of pressure. Change comes out of shitty life conditions. And so you could say that, you know, ultimately a solution is going to rise. You just don't know how much human suffering is going to happen in the meantime, but the solutions could come out of the diaspora. That's just what my thoughts are. Go ahead, Veronica.
Thanks.
Yeah, so Theo, you're very active talking about the Palestinian cause or the injustices that you're aware of, talking about it on social media and elsewhere in your literature. What do you hope to do? Like, what is your end goal? Because when I hear about it, and I've been sort of in and out trying to study this for many years, and I feel like the more I know, the less I know, or the less optimistic I feel. It just seems like an impossible situation to me, to be quite honest, even though South Africa was able to come out of apartheid. So it seems like if they were able to do it, anything is possible. But it feels very difficult, especially with what seems to be the far right government.
Yeah.
What do you hope to do with your own activism?
If you look at it through the lens that I'm looking at, and I know everyone here won't, but let's just say you are for right now. And this is a situation where Israel has set this situation up. They set the conditions, they could change the conditions. But Palestinians lack the power to change those conditions. That doesn't mean that Palestinians have been all good, or that they're going to have the best arrangement when their time comes to sit at the table, that they'll have the best negotiators or whatever it might be. But if you look at it through that lens, thinking very strategically, the United States has backed Israel in most everything they do. We've continually vetoed things in the Security Council. We still give them about $4 billion in aid a year. Germany gives them a bunch more. But basically we give them access to the international institutions that developed democracies have, and particularly trade. If the US decided to demand anything of Israel, like stopping a bombing campaign after 11 days that had targeted 19 medical clinics, and just insisting this stop, you saw the immediate result. Prime Minister, who's been in power for 12 years, finally is pushed out. So a lot happens. Now, how does something like that happen in the United States? Israel has enjoyed bipartisan support. All that had to happen was for a few Democrats to risk being called anti-Semites, and this will happen. It happens so often. If you support Palestinian rights, it's just, yeah, whatever. It's just, you mention it and someone's going to call you an anti-Semite. In my experience, few congressional representatives having the guts to say what's going on, buying space for others to say it. And it's now polarized within the Democratic Party. And now within one party, we can have an honest dialogue. In my opinion, once you have an honest, open dialogue, where someone's not having their career destroyed for supporting Palestinians, everything changes. So I think once we've launched that, if they can't shut it down in the Democratic Party, it opens up. Now, once you have both parties are divided, Israel can no longer rely on the United States, and it has to behave better. Germany is also a principal backer, as is France. A lot of that's tied up with Holocaust guilt. It's much harder to change because anti-Semitism coming out in Germany could get really nasty really fast, and they're scared to death of that. So I don't really know what to do with that situation. In the UK, Jews tend to be, they also get strong support from the UK. Jews tend to be much more conservative than in the United States. And my impression is they're much less concerned with Palestinian rights. So I would say having an honest debate in the Democratic Party can change everything. And then once you have any Democratic president, anyone I can imagine going back to Carter, they could guide the whole process, whatever is needed, as long as they have pressure from below. Again, I recognize that's a political position after a generally systematic presentation, so some might disagree with that here, and that's.
So I think we had Barbara, then Josh. I think that's Josh, Introvert Unbound, and then Khalid. Although
You know what, it's easier for you to criticize Israeli policy as a Jew than it would be for me, even as supposedly a neutral party, right?
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
But I mean, I find the same thing with women's issues. It's a lot easier for me to raise hell with one than it would be for you.
Yeah.
But so there's that. I have a question on Lebanon. You know, one of the things that seems to be coming out with all of this stuff that's been going on in the last year or so is an incredible level of corruption there. Yeah. And is that something that's never going to be amenable to a fix? And do you see the same thing in Israeli politics?
So I'd say with Lebanon, I look at this from the point of view of any sort of middle income country that's going to be almost always a major issue is you can't pay government officials enough. There's not enough employment. So people with political power employ people from their religious group, their ethnic group, their tribal group, whatever it is, and they support one another. They need one another for power. It's called Preventalism. No one ever uses the term, but there's a word for it. When you get your people good jobs and it corrupts the whole system. Lebanon's particularly problematic because of the system that the French set up in order to keep the Christians in power, which, what's the word? It reified all ethnic identities. So they're stronger than they should be for its level of economic and cultural development, because the political system doesn't integrate the parties. It doesn't allow for as integrated of it. It will always be integrated and it will always be separate. In many ways, it's similar to the Ottoman millet system, which it was like, well, Jews have their rights and Christians have their rights and Muslims have their rights. They just have their rights as separate communities and we don't integrate them. Similar to that. Now go to Israel. There's been a lot made of Israeli corruption in recent years. I honestly, I have such bad things to say about Israel, but I actually think they deal with their corruption pretty well. I mean, it's corrupt and they actually prosecute people. I mean, they put a former centrist prime minister in prison, Ehud Olmer, from like 2008, 2009. So I actually think they're doing a pretty good job in dealing with it. That tends to come with inequality as well. So as a system becomes more and more unequal economically, you'll tend to get more corruption, generally.
Okay, Josh?
Yes, hello. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was definitely interesting. So I
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you.
it. And I don't know a ton about the topic, but I've been following it for a while. So I noticed a lot of it is about the governments and not as much necessarily, or at least in your presentation, about what the individuals, the people, the citizens on the ground think. And I'd just be curious, you're not going to have numbers on this. I tried to do some research, and of course it's all over the place, but if you could make an estimate of what percentage of Israelis don't want Palestinians in the area at all, if they could just push a magic
Ooh.
button, and what percentage
Yeah.
of Palestinians wouldn't want Israelis in the area if they could push that magic button.
That's extremely difficult to answer. So I'm going to answer it by way of some various things. So 100% of the population here, it should fit on my screen equally. Now, people who want a two-state solution in Israel of some kind, something like 60%. Anything that could possibly be considered a workable two-state solution for Palestinians, it goes down to more like 25 or 30%. I've seen all kinds of surveys. This was what my politician friend summarized. He said, this is the problem. They want a two-state solution, but are they willing to like remove some of those settlements? Are they willing to make some compromises that would make it actually viable? The vast majority aren't. Now, within Israel proper, it's become normalized to talk about reducing the Palestinian population. I call it administrative ethnic cleansing, a lot of what's happening. Administrative ethnic cleansing happens when you push a group out through a number of administrative procedures, like discouraging people from coming back after they leave for college abroad, not allowing them to come back, incorporating an area on the border, it's close to the border. Let's just say we're going to try to incorporate that in any future Palestinian state. Let's see how far we can reach into Israeli territory to incorporate more Palestinians to get them out of the state. Let's create incentives for them to move to the West Bank. Let's make it difficult. Let's send criminals over there, whatever. I found it's fully normalized to talk about that kind of thing, but I think it's far margins, nothing I've seen personally where people talk about fully ethnically cleansing. I don't think you have people are talking, there's a lot of people seriously talking about a violent ethnic cleansing. The real problem in terms of, now with Palestinians, it's a mess. And the reason it's a mess is I can't pin down almost anybody I speak with. I can't pin down a position. And I can't pin down a position because I say, what do you think of a two-state solution? And they'll say something like, yeah, if it's possible, that would be great, but I don't think it's possible. So why are we talking about it? So they'll often respond like that, and they'll say, well, what do you think about one state with equal rights for all? Yeah, that would be wonderful, but I don't know if that's possible. So, well, what if you had to choose between advocating for the two? And it's like, well, we just want more rights. And then you start engaging, and I've actually found Palestinians are really flexible around it. So they'll bat around ideas all over the place. That's kind of the green that I see oftentimes. Part of it's a result of the fact that they just don't have the power to hold a strong position and get what they want. Part of it is I actually think they tend to be more yielding in many ways. Some of it's traditional Arab culture, which is warm and welcoming. It might be more hard on the inside, but wow, when you approach it, it's warm and welcoming. Now, the important thing to recognize is that Hamas, in their 2017 charter, not their original charter, and apparently they've had a number of revisions that have built up to this, they're very clear this land should belong to Palestinians, all of it. And they're also very clear, we are willing to compromise for a two-state solution based on 1967 borders. And they've been trying to talk about it for, I think it's since 2006 or 2009. Periodically, they'll bring it up. They'll try to have talks, and Israel won't engage them. Part of it is they don't believe them. Part of it is they don't want to. I don't know. I can't speak for them. So in that sense, I don't think there's a hard and fast group of Palestinians that say, we want all this land for ourselves. As far as Israelis are concerned, there's a significant portion that wants all of the land of the West Bank for the state. They don't expect to remove all Palestinians. They just want it all for the state of Israel as a Jewish state. Is that as clear? That's about as clear as I can be. Is that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Barbara?
So question on this boundaries from the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that sort of a big lie non-starter? I mean,
In what sense?
In the sense of, number one, they were indefensible, or at least, you know, as a military tactician, I would probably agree with Israel on that. Number two, we've now settled so much of the territory that's beyond those boundaries that that it's basically asking for an unwinding that's not going to happen. And given that that the attacks set off this thing, and it wasn't Israeli attacks, you know, as an older person who remembers this, right, watching it on TV, you know, I can say I can empathize with the older Israelis who say hell no to this, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, maybe Hamas knows that, and it looks really good on paper, right? And we can be the good guys, but it's beyond unrealistic.
So I think it's important to recognize in 1967, it's a point of controversy how the war started, and getting into that would be just so way off in a tangent for us. So let's say Arab states started the war. It's not normal. It's actually highly abnormal to take territory from a state you're at war with in the world today. Since World War II, almost no states have done so. Actually, as far as I've been active into the early 90s, and I'd go back as far as into the 60s, knowing almost the whole world, I can only think of, in terms of big territories being taken, Putin taking territory in Georgia and the Crimea, Saddam Hussein taking Kuwait and trying to take territory from Iran. Turkey took a small slice of territory in Cyprus that was all Turkish. I don't understand stuff in Western Sahara and Morocco. There's some kind of occupation that just got incorporated. You're getting into such small territories. Armenia took a very small slice of Azerbaijan, which was all Armenian. What Israel did in 67 was so far off of acceptable international behavior.
In terms of the percentage of territory that
In
that
percentage of territories, they took it from 3 states, and then they went and they did the same with Lebanon. So,
right.
So I've gone through this from multiple different phases. It's like, oh, well, I'm doing this as someone who's sort of looking at my Jewish heritage and looking at what's going on with my partner and my dad, and then I'm looking at collective trauma, and now I'm an advocate, and now I'm studying international relations. And it's like, well, from international relations perspective, this is just out of bounds. Like, you don't steal territories. Like, when you steal a territory, you give it back. And when you have an occupation, like in war, like in Iraq, that's got to be very limited, and it's got to end very quickly. You wrap it up as quickly as you can, and so I might have gotten away from your main question, or
no, not at all. I think you're just going right on to the question. So as to why Palestinians think that this is a reasonable request. And I guess when I think about World War II occupations, Russia annexed the territory, the U.S. Simply rebuilt the country. And the one thing is Israel has been, if I had to make a big criticism, the one thing Israelis have been totally unwilling to do is rebuild the countries that they've devastated, right? Instead, they've moved nutcase settlers in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't always the case in the
It was not
late
always the
60s
case.
and the early 70s. It was a very schizophrenic in the popular sense, just back and forth policy of what they would do, but they often tried to develop the West Bank. They thought they could integrate it into Israel if they developed. There were a lot of different views on it.
Right.
It's
looking at the U.S. Germany model and the U.S. Japan model, for example, people in that era would be thinking of that and thinking, well, all we need to do is civilize these people and we'll be able to live with them just fine.
Yeah. And in that case, all we have to do is build a democratic state for them. They've got the administrative apparatus there. Yeah, it was more difficult, but it was also the policies never. Can't remember which history book covered it in great depth.
If you find it, post it for us, because I think I'd love to read a little more.
Yes. Yeah. I might remember it by the time we're done here.
And Khalid is next. I just want to say that.
Great.
Right.
All right. I want to make sure that you guys can hear me because I've been having problems with my microphone. So is it working properly?
You're fine.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So my question / comment here is, I think it's important to acknowledge that the way Israel was established is by war. It won the war. And that's pretty much similar to the way most nations around the world were established. You know, you get into a war with people who are living in a particular place. If you win it, then you establish a state, and then you might or might not, make things better for the people you've won over. You might integrate them, or you might just decide to totally annihilate them. If you look at the history of how pretty much all nations and all successful groups of people, even prior to the level of development at which nations started to appear, that's how nations got developed. So it's pretty important to acknowledge that the way Israel started was after World War II. They went into another war with the Arabs, and then they won this war very comfortably. They claimed territories, and then with every single war they've won, and they claimed more and more territories. So this places them in a position of a winner at war, and it puts on them the responsibility of making things better for their subjects, for the people they've won over. But given the nature of that war, and that's why actually it's important to look at it as an Israeli-Arab conflict rather than Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's what Israel pretty much tries to do, to actually paint their image as more of a victim or more of a weak force surrounded by enemies from everywhere. Because if you look at every major war that's happened since 1948 or since the establishment of Israel, it's always been a war, like everything that you can really classify as war. It's always been a war between Israel and the Arabs, not just Palestinians. Because Palestinians do not really have never really had enough means to actually protect themselves or in a meaningful way, in a significant way. So my question is, when you also count in the level of radicality on both sides, on Palestinian side and Israeli side, should we just acknowledge that maybe this conflict will only end with another war? Like if we look at history, at the era, the period between World War I and World War II, you can see some failures of, the UN equivalent, the body that was in place before the UN, and how those mistakes led to another world war. Perhaps that whole conflict is one of the mistakes of the UN since its establishment, and perhaps it will only end with another global war.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there is No, I'm kind of going into some international relations theory here that new world orders are established after major international conflicts. And you see this after the French Revolution and all the disruption in Europe, that causes a new system is established. In 1815, the Concert of Europe. You see the same thing after World War I with the Peace of Versailles, and you break up a number of empires at that time and you redistribute those as states where you try to establish democracies. So in World War I, you break up the Russian Empire, you break up the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you create states around these. And then in World War II, we have a similar sort of situation, and you create international institutions that go with this order. So now in any more local situation, you also have that sort of situation arise. Part of the reason you have to reestablish a new order is because you have a new balance of power that needs to be maintained. You usually have a new hegemon that comes along that can sort of call the shots. They want to create something in their favor that's inclusive so no one rebels against it. So we have an American-led global order now that benefits the United States, but also the international institutions we established provide many benefits for other countries as well. We could look at something like that possibly playing out with Israel. The problem is, since a little after World War II, basically with the advent of nuclear weapons, any war among great powers threatens to be so utterly devastating. And Israel is a big enough power with anywhere from 80 to 300 nuclear warheads, probably on the lower end of that, that the damage they would do if they were seriously threatened in a major war now is too frightening to kind of think through. And it's quite possible that we'll have other states in the Middle East acquiring nuclear weapons sometime in the near future. Especially if Iran does, then you wind up with a whole sort of spiraling of an arms race where Saudi Arabia has to do it and Turkey might have to do it. So I don't see that as a viable possibility. I do see something similar, which is a major change in the either world order or in politics in the United States and Europe, changing Israel's position. A major transformation in Israel's position will change everything. I mean, South Africa, the real change for South Africa was colonialism died. By the 80s, it was the last state left that was up to this kind of thing in some ways. I mean, you're always going to have really nasty states out there that do their own unique, terrible things. But so I could see something comparable to what you're saying happen to settle it. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it does to some extent, but because like, okay, so the Palestinians are kind of radical in their demands, so are the Israelis, but the amount of radicalism, the real radicalism, the real calls for war, I see it on my Facebook feed. Like, I'm from Egypt and I've lots of friends from the Arab world, and those are the real people who reject any two-state solution, who reject any one-state solution. The only reality that they're able to see is kind of annihilating all the Jews, and like those are two things that are usually equated in the Arab world, Jews and, like, if you want to call them Zionists or Israelis or whatever, but like there's that sense of, you know, the only way this can end is for that entire triangular land to be called Palestine once again. And there are lots of subcultures around that, and there are lots of people who actually casually volunteer, you know, to participate if a war is upcoming. And it's extremely important as well to acknowledge that this can be an extremely powerful unifying force for the divided Arab nations that for most of their history used to be a single nation. And at some point, some political leader will emerge and will try to use this. Some people are trying, some political leaders are trying to use this already But at some point, someone will succeed in that, and someone will use Israel as that common enemy to unite those 400 million Arabs and more, actually. Maybe it will even come from Turkey, which is not an Arab country at all. But like, or maybe even Iran, which is also not an Arab country, but also has lots of stakes in the game. So at some point, some political power will actually succeed to unify these vast lands against that common enemy. And I think it's just like peace talks are just postponements for this sad reality.
Yeah, it's always a possibility. Certainly that was when Barbara was growing up, some of the times you mentioned that was the way it looked set to be for some time. It's I'm less in that mindset. I've moved away from it even since the 90s, thinking in those terms. Also, in many ways, the Arab world has abandoned Palestinians, but at the same time, yeah, there's always potential there. I think the nuclear weapons tend to change everything, but we have some really extreme movements in the world now that seem to want to draw death down upon themselves. So that does become a possibility. And in that case, wow, I'm kind of at a loss now. I don't want to see that happen. I have another bias, which is just any state, once it's established, you got to keep borders. That's sort of the like bedrock basis of the international system. You can change how the state functions. You can change who's included in it. But you've got to keep the borders. And if you break up any borders, it's usually got to be, well, we hived off a portion of south of Sudan to make South Sudan, or of Serbia to make Kosovo, something like that. In this case, wow, it could be a disaster. But that was Carter's fear. Jimmy Carter, as president of the United States in the late 70s, thought that World War III could break out in the Levant, this general region we're talking about, and he wanted to prevent it. So he staked everything in his in his foreign policy on creating a Middle East peace. So.
Theo, I have one comment and then one question. Kind of adding on to your comment about how the advent of nuclear weapons changed everything. I guess I would argue that the advancement of conventional war-making technology has also changed it because, you know, I'm somewhat of a World War II buff, and so I get inculcated with all these statistics about, you know, the Germans lost this many tanks and they lost this many, and the Americans lost this many airplanes. If you had a major conventional war break out between major powers, they might be able to sustain it for a couple months, but then they're gonna outstrip their industrial capability. You know, it's one thing to build you can build a B-17 relatively quickly. You can't build a stealth bomber. It takes years. Anyway, that's just a comment. But my question, this kind of goes back to when we were first talking in a group about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Josh had posted some questions up there, and I saw a lot of comments coming out of the particularly the spiral dynamics community, that in a sense reduced it all to, you know, it's purple, red Palestinians versus orange Israelis. Now, I'm not saying that there's not an element of truth to that, but I've always said, man, that's just way, way too simplistic. And then your hour presentation just blew my mind that it's just, so my question is, how do you respond? How do you respond when you get drawn into a conversation when somebody throws out this, oh yeah, it's a purple red Palestinians versus the orange Israelis, and so blah 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 blah. How do you respond without necessarily getting drug into 5 hours of
Yeah, that's a tough one. How do you deal with that? I mean, I tend to see labeling people as colors as a way to, I mean, it's all in the intent, but if you're trying to win an argument for a particular side and you label a player as being at a certain level of very low development, that's like such an abuse of higher development and of spiral dynamics. To me, that I try to keep that stuff out of bounds. It's almost impossible. I mean, Veronica and I met on Integral Global, which is just such a madhouse. I spent a lot more time on Integralists with Joe Perez's stuff doing discussions, but so you'll see a lot of that there. I don't know what to do with it. I mean, because I can speak from personal experience and I can speak with a lot of facts and say, okay, well, the worst place would be in Gaza with Hamas. And so Hamas would be anti-education, but well, no, it's as educated as the United States. Almost certainly not at the same level, grade for grade and degree for degree. Hard to imagine, but they've done as much schooling, and women as well as men. And yeah, I can't see it. I mean, if I think red, I think it's lawless. It's fights for power. It's gang warfare among the people who are in power. And you don't see that. Actually, what I see with Hamas, I just compare them with, well, where have there been occupations and what kind of resistance force arose in those? So in Iraq, when the US held it, ISIS arose. Like Hamas is 1,000 times better than ISIS. The worst things they've ever done is throw homosexuals from buildings. Actually, they haven't done that. ISIS did that, and the videos were taken and people said they were Hamas. So I tend to see them as much more amber, and there's probably some strong red elements in there, and there's probably a little bit of orange in there. And yeah, it just makes no sense to me. I babbled through that. Sorry, I didn't need to say
no, that's
at
okay.
all.
I didn't expect to necessarily. It's just, I sometimes want to wade into those, but it's like, oh God, how can I do this without getting sucked in? Anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got a 20,000 foot left field kind of question here now,
Yeah.
which is about looking at the kind of various international 2030, 2050 pledges around net zero and the consequences that's going to have for the geopolitics of oil. I mean, one very sort of high level analysis of this is you could see the whole conflict as a kind of outcrop of the whole oil power dynamics. Do you see what I mean? And the fragile pieces maintained because of oil politics, etc. Blah 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 blah. But as that's going to shift radically, do you know? And this is almost impossible to chart out in one's mind. How do you potentially see that playing out in the region?
I actually see that's a great question because as the U.S. has become much less reliant upon Middle East oil, the Obama administration made a very conscious decision to pivot to Asia. And that meant getting out of the Middle East. Well, what does getting out of the Middle East mean? Of course, it meant shutting down the Iraq War. But it also meant when something breaks out there, we're going to be a little more hands-off. So I think it was a disaster, and it's a whole different story. But when the dictator of Yemen was removed from power after 30 years in the Arab Spring, and they set up a transitional government, and in the middle of the transitional government, trying to consolidate power and eventually hold elections, they created a new constitution. It was a nothing government. And there's a rebel movement, the Houthis, that come into power, they steal power, they need to be put down. This was an internationally approved of process. The whole world had approved of this. They got rid of a dictator. So what does the US do? We just say, okay, we're going to leave it to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wound up creating mayhem, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world there, or you could say the fighting wound up doing that, but whatever, the result was disastrous. But that was what the US decided to do. They call it offshore balancing. We're just going to keep a balance of power, and we'll balance with whoever doesn't have power. That's one way of doing it. Now that looks really cynical to most Americans, but it's like, okay, if Israel is too powerful and they've joined together with Saudi Arabia, which is actually quite possible that in the near future that will become a serious alliance, strangely. And now they're in a war with Iran. Oh, we're gonna balance over towards Turkey, and all of a sudden we're gonna break up that block. And so that's one way of dealing with it. But what ultimately happens is if the US pulls out, we don't cover for Israel. We don't concern ourselves with Israel. Okay, yeah, sure, they're an ally. They're an ally like Poland is an ally, but Poland's really problematic in all kinds of ways right now too. So we're not going to stick our neck out for them. That very well could happen in the near future, and that could radically change things. The situation could radically change.
But if I may,
yeah,
like the shift in oil is that the US is depending less on Middle Eastern oil, but then other global powers are. Do you think China might play a role in the Middle East, or do you think that's a good thing? Or
I didn't think that Russia would until they entered Syria, and I thought it was a horrible thing from a humanitarian's perspective. I'm a liberal Democrat. I want to see more democracies, liberal Democrat in the classic sense and in the contemporary sense. I want to see more democracies where there's more freedom in the world. And so I always see it as almost always see it as problematic when a world power that's an autocracy is gaining in power. Although in many ways, China is much more stable than the United States with how they manage their international affairs. They don't tend to invade countries. They invade very little. They're just genocidal within and totalitarian on the margins. So you could say there's some benefits, but I think it would be very difficult for Israel to ally with countries outside the West. I think it would just be very difficult. Part of it is that the strong ethnic identification with the West, like so much of the Israeli identity is dependent on that, even though there's about half the country is made up of people like myself who descend from the Middle East. And I should say it, I'm referring to myself as Jewish, but it's like shorthand for of Jewish heritage. That's only half Jewish heritage. I'm Jewish enough that I've got my foot in all this. So I should just say that for whatever it's worth to anybody, if it matters. But I think Israel's going to tend to identify with Europe. They're going to want to see themselves as part of the class of developed democracies. And China could gain power, maybe through allying with Iran. That's like one possibility. Turkey's kind of a wild card sometimes with who they're going to ally with. The Egypt's connection to the United States could wear thin under Sisi if Biden decides to focus more on human rights than on international stability. All sorts of possibilities.
I lost track of the order, so I don't know who's next. Right now, Barbara and Josh have their hands up.
I think Josh was next.
Okay. Josh?
Yeah. So I have just a few things I was thinking. So based on what folks were saying. So yeah, personally, I'm an American Jew. I'm not religious or secular or whatever. And I'm of the opinion, you know what, if Palestine says they want some specific borders, just give them the damn land, right? But I kind of believe what Khalid is saying at the same time of that's not going to be enough. that there is, and you can call it anti-Semitism. I think that term gets tossed around a lot. You know, I don't think that everyone who opposes the Israeli government is anti-Semitic. That's tossed around. There's sort of like casual anti-Semitism in the U.S., which sometimes is not anti-Semitism all. Sometimes is actually fake. Sometimes is real. But there is something that is going on in certain places around the world where it's a for real, like an actual for real anti-Semitism. And I think what ends up happening is there'll be certain folks who will focus almost obsessively on that, say folks on the right, and exaggerate it, because there'll be folks on the left, however you want to frame this, you know, green, orange, it doesn't matter, who will just kind of look at, yeah, but what about all this thing? So it ends up putting that in one folks' court. So the only folks who are actually talking about the anti-Semitism are folks on the right who are going to distort that, whereas a lot of folks on the left it's kind of a cultural Marxism thing, right? Where there's the oppressor and the oppressed, and there's certainly some dynamics of that can be argued in the case of Israel. But the idea that that's okay, you're you know, a Jew, an Israeli, you're an oppressor. You're in Palestine, you're a Palestinian, you are the oppressed. I think if you take it from the government level down to the individual human level, that does not apply at all. And then tying into the idea of that old quote, oh, when you're younger, you're a socialist, when you're older, you're a conservative. And I've been thinking about that for a while because, well, that doesn't track to biodynamics, right? As you age, in theory, you should be. So I think there are a couple things that might be, first of all, it's just maybe untrue. And second of all, it's that, you know, a lot of the folks who were on the left in 1995 are now considered centrist, right? So it's not like they moved right. It's certain belief systems. But I think one piece that is central to all of this is you're Palestinian, you're an Israeli, whatever. If, let's say you're in America, you're like, well, I pontificate in this way about this thing. If you're getting rockets fired on you from either side, your politics change pretty damn fast. And I would argue that's because you're spiral dynamics wise, you're dropping into beige. Like it's literally, at least some aspect of it, you're literally concerned for your life. So yeah, you can be a leftist liberal in Israel and you're still like, yeah, but I saw that thing come and it, you know, knocked down my, you know, neighbor's building and I'm afraid all the time. And then of course you're living in Palestine. You're like, well, they, you know, they're knocking down our buildings. So I don't want to die. These people must be evil. So I think that's a piece that those of us who can sort of weigh these issues in a very cool collective manner, I don't think that's really an option when buildings and bombs are literally falling all around you.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot in what you're saying. So I'll take some of that last part because I think I can say some stuff that will be really relevant and interesting to people here. My book before last, The Holocaust We All Deny, Collective Trauma in the World Today, which I'm revising as we speak, rewriting in some ways, taking it off the hands of my very small publisher and just doing my own thing with it. One of the things that comes up when looking at collective trauma is personal trauma is somatic. It's in your body. It's in your nervous system. It's not in your imagination wholly. It is in your imagination. But collective trauma is constructed. It's socially constructed. So you can suffer. So take the Germans. Somehow they take their defeat in World War I, and they construct a narrative out of it that's intimately tied to a political process that says they were stabbed in the back by socialists. This is the big lie of Hitler's big lie. Well, it's actually first it's the general's big lie, and then it's Hitler's big lie, the Nazis' big lie. They're stabbed in the back by generals, and they have to do this whole thing, and you wind up with the Third Reich. Now you take the same country, having suffered through all the devastation of World War II, where most of their major cities were obliterated by Allied bombing, which was itself largely genocidal, and they've just perpetrated the Holocaust, which tends to make groups pretty extreme when they perpetrated genocide, especially one of that magnitude. And then they come out and they reconstruct all of their social trauma, and they wind up with a socially democratic solution. A completely different national identity arises out of that. No, it's not the exact same collective traumas that they've suffered, the real traumas, the bombings, the dead bodies, the cultural dislocation, all of that, the hyperinflation of 1923, but a lot of it's the same, and they wind up with a totally different solution. What I'm saying is that what I'm trying to get at is Jewish suffering over 2,000 years of anti-Semitism was very real. The Holocaust was very real. There was bound to be some construction of collective trauma. As Jews across the world sought to make sense of the Holocaust, and then several wars with Arab states in their only state that they've had for at least 1,000 years, maybe over 2,000 years, depending on whether one state actually existed or not, whatever. A long time. It's been a long time since they had a state. Now the state's at war all the time. Now they're suffering terrorist attacks. That could have been approached in a completely different way. The narratives that could have been constructed nationally could have been completely different. Israel constructed their collective trauma in a way that I don't think was very beneficial to them in the long run. So I know someone who wrote a book. God, this guy really, he's an Israeli Jew who, Gilad Atzmon, who's a brilliant analyst of Israeli culture and psychology, but also, wow, he's the closest I've seen to anti-Semitic. Certainly his Facebook page gets a lot of really borderline stuff. But he points out something really interesting. The Holocaust leads Jews in Israel to think that they're going to experience another Holocaust when there's no source that's likely to give them another Holocaust. And then you have Hamas using language in their 1988 charter, not in their most recent charter, that talks, well, actually it's not in their charter, that part. You'll have people talk about pushing the Jews into the sea. Actually, literally, in the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948, they were literally pushed into the sea in boats. So nobody was drowning by it. There were some massacres. They were literally pushed into the sea. So you see them using the thing that will scare the Jews in Israel, playing on their collective trauma and the way they've constructed it into a narrative that are going to be destroyed. But states are almost never destroyed in the world today. Once we have nuclear weapons, it almost never happens. They collapse from within. That happens a lot. You have state collapse. But a state that's completely destroyed, wiped off the map, I can't think of the last state that's happened to. You have new ones created out of empires. So it's interesting how the things we fear, and the likelihood of, at the height of Palestinian terrorist attacks, say during the second intifada between about 2000 and 2005. I just saw the numbers, so they're fresh in my mind. It was either 1,000 or 2,000 people were killed. I think it was about 1,000 Israelis though. This, like, driving, and if you've ever driven on Israeli roads, vastly more dangerous. If they were American roads, they'd be more dangerous. Israeli roads there's 1 in 10 drivers is crazy. The rest are great. So again, there are different ways we can construct a national narrative, construct an identity, construct a collective trauma, and make sense of it and grapple with it. That said, I just want to add one more thing, which is Jews have done a phenomenal thing in conceptualizing genocide after the Holocaust for all groups under threat of genocide around the world. In that sense, Jews did a phenomenal job with collective trauma because they actually grappled with it intellectually, therapeutically, on so many different levels. But I'm sensing the group looks baked.
You know, one thing I'm going to bring back to, and that is, you know, in the 40s, Jews were the only Jews from Europe left around were survivors. They were people who fought back, you know, and one of the things that if you talk to, well, not anymore, right? But I'm old enough to have actually talked to some of the survivors
Nice.
personally. And one of the things that they seem to believe is that they should have started fighting back much sooner.
Yeah.
In other words, what moron got in that damn cattle car? It literally, you hear them say, and so there's also that history of what, you know, maybe we'd all still be dead, but at least we wouldn't feel like morons who were led off to slaughter, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is that in the history where
Absolutely.
it's, and I think we're losing that now in the younger generation who, but every time Hamas loosens an attack or whatever, you begin to get people who go back to that, right? And great grandma can come into family dinner and say, see, we told you so. They're going to kill us all.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to lay out one thing, since so much of this centers around Hamas. It's important to recognize that Gaza tends to be bombed by Israel about once or twice a week. So if you're on the pages of people who, and you'll only see it on people's pages and very small sites, it's just the norm. There was bombings for the night before last and the night before that in Gaza. They're so constant that there's this idea that Hamas just, whoa, they get mad about something and they fire rockets off into Israel. Like this last time it happened after pogroms went through this East Jerusalem neighborhood, throwing people out of their homes. I say pogroms because it was mobs of settlers backed by military, which wasn't doing it. So it was extra legal violence, and they were stealing people's homes. And they were aiming to throw hundreds of families out of their homes. And then Israel went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third most holy place for Muslims. And they injured, what was it, like about 600 people. So they had soldiers in the mosque, and they were firing weapons and firing grenades, and Hamas was striking back for that. So in that case, they were striking back. Sometimes when they started firing weapons into Israel, as one Harvard professor, sort of the expert on Hamas, put it, it happened after a week where Israel had killed an unusually large number of Gazans, but they were killing Gazans throughout for the whole year that they had been in power before they started firing on Israel. So now, that doesn't mean Jews in Israel aren't thinking they're going to die from this. But then again, as my friend, the politician on the border of Gaza, said, when his wife said to him, it was interesting to watch them interact. She says, but Hamas firing these rockets at us. And he says, he looks over at me, and it's kind of sexist move, but he kind of says, like, yeah, if they hit you on the head. And you look at the rockets, and the rockets were a little bigger this time. They're about this big. They don't tend to explode because they lack the explosive materials, or they explode more like firecrackers. So in 2014, the civilian death ratio was 245 Palestinian civilians killed for every Israeli. This time around, it was closer to 25 to 1. So I strongly would challenge the narrative, and it's hard. You have to go to smaller sites that have excellent reporting to see the constant sort of bombardment. And a blockade is an act of war. Internationally, as recognized as an act of war. So Gaza is under a constant act of war that has crippled the lives.
The Nazis, when the Nazis did retaliation, it was 10 to 1 or 100 to 1.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so you would think that of all people, Israelis would go, hell no to this. But because of the history of what happened with the Nazis. But again, I can see why the thought is, my gosh, we have fascism coming, rearing its ugly head in the same way as in Europe.
Absolutely. So I wrote a book on genocide around collective trauma. And one of the saddest things I came to around it is victims become perpetrators of genocide so often that it's actually one of the primary indicators of whether a group is going to commit genocide. I have no statistics to back that up. All I can say is the Hutu experienced a partial genocide in Burundi right next door to Rwanda. They're like sister states, prior to committing genocide against Tutsis in the early 90s. The Serbs experienced genocide at the hands of the Croatian Ustasha, who are aligned with the Nazis in World War II. Interestingly, they were so extreme that Hitler had to ask them to tamp down their violence against Serbs. And so they then treat the people they're fighting as, which was mainly Bosnians, but also for some time Croatians in the early 90s, as the Nazis. So you have this sort of situation happen often where a group that was victimized in one generation will turn around the next and become the perpetrator of crimes against humanity. So I actually think in the construction of how you conceive of your collective trauma, you've got to be really careful not to do this. You can't play never again too hard if you're the group that was hit. You have to play it just right. You see the same thing in Armenia now. Armenia experienced the first major genocide of the 20th century. The first was the Herero in Namibia under the Germans, but the Armenians got the really big one. It was forgotten about for generations. And now mostly the Armenian American diaspora has made a very big deal out of it. And it's hampered Armenia's relations with Turkey, which has pushed them into the hands of Russia, which means their democracy is threatened. So all I can say is, on a meta level of constructing national narratives, how do we conceive of ourselves? Where are we going? Israel could do a lot that would benefit them greatly, that would make them feel more secure. And in making them feel more secure, would allow them to carry on in a much more peaceful and just manner. How we yeah, go ahead.
I think it's super interesting, Theo, to consider how that trauma gets passed on, and you study collective trauma, and I always find it interesting to look at humanity as an organism and see how the different parts of the organism are reacting to itself. And on the one hand, it seems kind of like privileged and like we're sitting here analyzing the situation when we're not living it, and it seems kind of hypocritical. But on the other hand, I mean, I think why we got interested in integral theory in the first place, or spiral dynamics, is because we're interested in more than just ourselves or more than just our clan. We're interested in humanity at large, and we're interested in identifying patterns, because maybe if enough of us start to identify those patterns, we can do something about it, or we can decide differently, because we do form a part of the collective, even though in our own small little ecosystem, and maybe we affect a small part of the ecosystem. But even just that awareness, I mean, if collective trauma exists on a more energetic level, if more of us become aware of the patterns, then maybe something can happen even at that higher level, energetic level.
Absolutely. So my dissertation for my PhD is on reconstructing the global imaginary. So the global so a national imaginary, social imaginary is, how do we conceive of ourselves related in a group of people? Is it through some racial identity or religious, or are we tied together through citizenship in a state? And what's the moral order that holds us together? And what are the mores that hold us together? And so what's the global imaginary? That's really confusing. We do conceive of ourselves as bound together with the rest of humanity, but upon what basis? And what's going on in that global imaginary? the way all of humanity conceives itself as related. So for me, I see hot spots in the world where serious crimes against humanity are taking place as threatening a stable and robust global imaginary wherein human beings across the world can conceive of themselves as bound together, as related, as capable of cooperating. I see the whole thing unraveling in conflict zones. So in that sense, Israel takes center stage. It also does because anything that Israel does tars the United States, which tars the international order. It sort of pushes the boundaries of acceptable behavior in a negative direction in the international order. Syria, under Assad does the same, but Syria's a rogue state. You all know it. They're a disaster. Like, we can set them aside. Saudi Arabia, we can set aside. It's Saudi Arabia. Israel, it's a developed democracy, and then it's not. And that gets confusing. So we have an idea of what liberal, democratic, developed states are supposed to be like and the role they play in the world order. And we get mad when they don't do what they're supposed to do, and they do things like invade Iraq without the approval of the UN Security Council. But so I think it's really important that we conceive on this higher level, that we sort of, well, how do we can we conceive of ourselves as citizens of the world and have a nice, healthy relationship to that? Or when we start thinking of ourselves as citizens of the world, do we feel like feckless, naive fools, incapable of getting anything done because there's so much conflict in the world, we've got to have our backs up? And in that sense, I think working on these kinds of issues can be really useful for people in communities like this.
So are you using some of Harari's concepts of imagined identities?
Yes. He
is one of my favorite authors.
Yeah. He's brilliant. And he's also Israeli. He's brilliant.
He is.
Yeah, he does a phenomenal job of summarizing history and from multiple different disciplines. In some ways, it's not specialized enough for me to do much with it, but I've got him referenced. He certainly summarizes the idea of imagined institutions and identities better than most.
Right, and I think every time I read any of his work, I think about going back to the stories, the myths we tell. We're just telling the wrong stories. We're telling the wrong myths, and so I see it happening in the United States now. I agree fully with telling the truth about some of the horrors of American history, because they're pretty bad, and every time you dig deeper, you find worse ones. But on the other hand, by telling those stories you can also end up with creating collective trauma where there wasn't any.
Absolutely. That's what I think's happened in Armenia. I hate to say that, because I'm like,
I think you're right.
Got to look at the Armenian situation as a very poor landlocked country and it's like, they were doing pretty well, and they wanted to make peace. I've read one book on this. Maybe I'm wrong, but they were really wanting to make peace with Turkey, and they needed the trade. And then all these Armenian Americans came along, very much people like myself. This is the kind of thing I would do. They're like, we have got to recognize this genocide we suffered, because we're seeing it in our families today. We're seeing the trauma as it's been passed down. And Turkey is just...
And I guess I think about my grandmother whose parents were basically serfs in Europe and had a heck of a time here. And, I see that collective trauma in some of her beliefs. Like back in the 50s when I was a kid, people just didn't starve in the United States the way they did when she had to leave school, because her 10 cents a week literally fed the family in the cold winter. And luckily, that wasn't the story that she told. She told the story of, so I left home and took a job and fed my family.
Yeah.
And think about the difference between, between that model and, oh my God, it was so awful and the family will never survive it, right? I mean, I just consider all the time how lucky I am that she basically told me the story of, you're poor and you're going to work your butt off, and guess what? You will survive.
Yeah.
Don't worry about all this.
Yeah.
Trauma's out there. So what?
Hey,
It's
everybody,
interesting.
I have to jump in. I'm sorry. We've had Theo here talking for 2.5 hours.
I didn't realize it was that long.
Yes, and he's done an amazing job. Should we let him off the hook?
Thank you.
I feel like we could all keep talking because this is very interesting, but I'm sure he has things to get to.
Yeah, I actually do. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've really appreciated interacting with you all. And I'm a little bit sorry I've answered your questions in a lengthier manner than I had intended to. I haven't fully integrated all my knowledge in that sense to be as concise as I'd like to be. So my apologies on that end.
But
Not a problem
group
at
that
all.
likes to think stuff through. And so we love to hear you thinking out loud. We certainly wouldn't hold it against you.
It's great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this was just incredible. I didn't have any questions because I was just listening and learning from everybody. It was just amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was an awesome discussion. Just beautiful. Yeah, thank you. And then so much today.
Appreciate it. Well, good. And thank you again, Veronica, for helping get me set up. I don't know if everyone has so many questions, but I think I took more of your time than I needed to as well.
No, this group could talk and talk and talk. It's a group of talkers. So this all fit in quite well together. So thank you, Theo.